Hi, everybody. Welcome to part two of the data analysis series. In this video, we're going to focus on analyzing qualitative data, some similarities to quantitative, but also some differences. Your qualitative data might include field notes or interviews or journals or open-ended items on a questionnaire. Typically, qualitative focuses on words, quantitative focuses on numbers. We're going to follow a similar process with qualitative data in that we're going to reduce the data. Now in quantitative, we reduce the data, excuse me, by creating some kind of a chart or a table. That may not be the same case for qualitative, but we are going to reduce the data so it's manageable, interpret the data, try to make sense of what's there, and then draw conclusions, really thinking about, okay, what does that mean when we see that data? So it's a similar process for both quantitative and qualitative, but there are some unique differences. We'll focus on those in this video. One of them is that qualitative actually relies on quite a bit of interpretation because it's not clean cut like numbers. And so I looked up the definition of interpret, and it is to explain the meaning, and then I added of the data. So you're going to explain what these data mean in a systematic way that lets you draw conclusions and use that to help you as a teacher. So to do that takes deep analysis. I almost think that it takes deeper analysis than the quantitative, because with quantitative, you can look on a chart or a pie graph and you can actually see the differences. With qualitative, you as the researcher have to bring out the differences. So it takes that deeper thinking, but it's my favorite type of research. You'll be searching for categories or themes, and I'll kind of talk you through some strategies for doing that. Themes do not really emerge from the data. What emerges after much hard work, and this is definitely true, and creative thought, is an awareness in the mind of the researcher that there are patterns of order that seem to cut across excuse me, various aspects of the data. When these patterns become organized and, quote, visual to the researcher, then they can be called themes. Now, I added the last part to this quote. I added the visual, and I meant those to be like visual to be like in air quotes, because it isn't actually that you can visually see the patterns, but in your mind, the patterns start to reveal themselves to you. And I don't mean to say that in like this mystical kind of way. I'll talk a little bit about how you can facilitate that happening. But to me, this is the awesome part of qualitative research, is that you have all these words. You have interviews, you have questionnaires, you have student writing samples where they're reflecting on their work. You have things kids have said, and you have to make sense of that. And as you go through the process, you start to get these aha moments like, oh, that's what that means, or that's why they're doing that. And so emerge, reveal, those are kind of hazy words. And so it isn't that the answers just jump out at you, but through your deep thinking, you're going to figure out some cool things about what's going on in the minds of your students. So first, you're going to become immersed in that data. And I like to do that by just getting everything together and reading through it all. I don't want to do any kind of analysis yet. I just want to read through all my data. If you start analyzing too early, start kind of drawing conclusions at the beginning, then by the time you get to the end, you've already colored your view. So you try to read everything just with an open mind, just like you're reading the newspaper. You're just reading what the students have revealed to you. Then you're going to analyze, and I'll take you through the steps of how to do that analysis part. But you're really going to start looking for those patterns. And then once you find those, you're going to interpret those. You're going to try to figure out, what does this mean? for my teaching. That's the interpret part. So here's an example. In my e-textbook study, I asked the students to, in their interviews and journals and questionnaires, to write about what features of the e-textbook they found useful. And so as I was reading those 3 data sources, the interviews, questionnaires, journals, I noticed that a lot of students were commenting on the digital note sharing feature, where they could write notes, type notes while they're reading their textbook, and then they could share them with other people. And so I was like, oh, I didn't realize that would be something that was one of their favorite features. That was revealed to me from their data. In their comments helped me to see that's what they found important. So in my writing, then I linked that finding to what I had noted in my literature review. So when you're writing that part 2, your data analysis, you're going to want to refer back to some things in your literature review to say how what you found, what you're kind of discovering, is similar or different. So in my literature review, I had a section about reading with technology, and I'm linking what I found from my students' comments to this idea that social interaction can have a positive effect for the students that I also work with. And then I include an example. So you can definitely include examples from student samples that you've collected for your data. Not all of them by any means, 1, maybe 2. I use a screenshot to do that. Notice, just like in the quantitative video, there's specific APA style that you use when you're including a figure. So figures are photos, student examples, really anything that's not a chart, not a table. So charts are also figures, but for this qualitative example, this is a screenshot of the note sharing feature. And so notice I label that and I give it a title. So I support what I said in my writing with an example from something that my students did, which is a good thing for you to do also. So if I had to put this qualitative analysis into steps, it would look like this. First, I'm going to get all that data together, all in one place. I'm going to read through it all. I'm going to immerse myself in that data. And then I'm going to start the analysis. And this is the place where it gets really fun. I love this process. I'm going to start with disassembling the data. And that means I'm going to break it down into smaller chunks. Now, there's lots of ways you can do this. I like to use colored sticky notes, and then I can write some comments on those colored sticky notes. Other people like to use highlighters. Other people like to actually cut apart the data, the written data, cut it apart into paragraphs or sentences. Be sure if you're going to highlight or cut that you save a paper copy that you don't mess with, just so you have another copy of it. But you break the data down into smaller chunks, and you're going to start, as you do that, you're going to start noticing that some chunks have things in common. And so you're going to start putting them in a pile together and giving them a label or a code. So you remember back with my e-textbook table that I showed you, I had the positive features that students identified, and I started sorting those into categories. No, I think I haven't showed you that yet. I think that's going to come up next, so I'll talk about that in just a second. So you break it into smaller chunks, then you start reassembling it into piles of things that go together, and you've labeled those somehow. Then when you have your pile, you start reading through, and that's where you're going to do your interpreting. You read through that pile, and then you're going to describe, well, what do you notice about this? What do you notice about all these comments that go together? That's the interpreting part. Now, you'll have some pieces of data that won't fit into a nice, neat pile, and that's okay. You don't have to include everything in your analysis, but try to get a significant group so you can start thinking, okay, what are my students trying to tell me here? What is their data revealing to me? And that's when you draw the conclusion. So you figure out, okay, what is it? What do you notice about this data? I noticed that my students not all, a lot of my students liked the digital note sharing feature. Okay, what is that telling me? It tells me that they like the social interaction when they're reading. And so that's my conclusion. Picking out those labels or codes can be the trickiest part. Again, like with quantitative, there's lots of gray here. There's no right answer. There's no certain kind of words or codes or labels that you should use. It has to be what makes sense to you. What I've included here are just some broad categories of what those codes might be. And you would have to make those more specific to fit what you're looking at in your data. You can see with everybody having different kinds of qualitative data, it's really difficult for me to tell you exactly what kinds of codes you will use. And again, no right or wrong answers here. Think about what makes sense to you and what kind of is revealed, what emerges from that data when you start putting those together in similar groups. So here's the example I was mentioning earlier. As I was reading my students' journals, their surveys, and the transcripts of the interviews that I did, I started to notice that some students had reasons that they preferred the e-textbook, some had reasons that they preferred the print instead. And so I sorted those into two categories. And then it worked out that I could put those into a table. Not all qualitative data is going to fit nice into a table, but this one happened to. So notice my APA format for labeling my table. I have table 2. I have the title of my table. Notice on this table that I'm also following APA format for how the data are laid out. So I have columns. They have headings. The headings are in bold. There are no lines on tables in the APA format. That's a really basic thing to remember. If you're unsure of how to lay out a table in APA format, please go to the OWL website that I included earlier in our class and just type in correct table format and you'll find examples of how a table should look. Notice there are no numbers. It's just the basic information in this table. Oh, I should add too, I didn't include everything on this table. There's some data that I left out. Some data that didn't fit into categories nicely and neatly. That's okay. You're looking for the main chunks of conclusions that you can draw. Now, how do you show qualitative data? Because you can't really make this, I showed you a table, but it doesn't always work that way. But you could, if you can, a table can be useful. You could use an example of student work that illustrates a point, which is the example that I showed you about the note sharing feature, or you can embed comments within a paragraph, and I'll show you in just a second how I did that. So you may have some really good examples, not all the comments, but pick out just a couple that help illustrate your point that you want to make. So here's what I did. In my e-textbook article, my heading, Applying Reading Strategies to Digital Text, I went back to my lit review and pulled up forward this idea of cognitive flexibility that I had talked about previously, and now I have an example of that I found in my data. So what I found as I was looking and sorting and adding labels is that the students were talking about in the e-textbook, they had to really reorient themselves while they were reading, because they might read some text, then they might watch a video, then read some more text and listen to a podcast. And every time they were changing to a different media, they had to get their mind back to, okay, how do I make sense of a video? How do I comprehend a text? How do I comprehend a podcast? And so they had to keep moving between these media to really understand understand the information in the e-textbook. So that was my category, this flexibly adapting every time they had to reorient themselves. I have my category. Now I picked out a couple of the best quotes to explain that. And you can see those listed below. So I bulleted those and I used the quotation marks from the students. If I wanted to, I could have included their name, although remember you're using a pseudonym, a fake name for your students, but you can include that in your writing to give them credit for what they said. So I'm embedding my data into the paragraph. So that's that third way of displaying data for qualitative research. Now, here's another example. I showed you previously Table 2 with their preferences, things they liked about the e-textbook, things they preferred about print textbook. And you can see here, I highlighted where it says Table 2. So I have my table off to the side, but embedded in my paragraph, I want to give some more specific examples. So I'm quoting my students again here. I'm embedding that right in the paragraph. Like the last example, I had the bullets with their quotes. This time I decided to embed it right in the paragraph. When I do that, notice I have to add some linking sentences. So I have one student said, blah, blah, blah. Another student's print preference was expressed in this way, blah, blah, blah. I have to kind of link those together so my paragraph has this nice, smooth flow. And notice how I compared, in quantitative analysis, you can compare averages or you can compare numbers in different columns, pre-test, post-test. Well, it's not as easy to compare in qualitative, but I was able to do that here. So I have one quote that shows one kind of side of the coin and another quote that shows the other side of the coin. And I always pick the best examples for these quotes. So if you have kids that said things that just weren't really articulate, don't use them in your examples. Pick the really good ones that make your point that you're trying to make. Okay, so it's a hazy process. I really can't get more specific than what I've done here. If you want more specific to your data, I would be glad to set up a Zoom meeting with you and we can share the screen and you can show me things and I can help you a little bit more. Also, I encourage you to take advantage of those smart people on your writing team because they're right in the thick of things too. I love this process of qualitative data analysis, partly because you don't really know what's going to happen at the end until you get there. And that's what makes it kind of cool. And you as the researcher get to have a lot more say in interpreting the data. So I don't know what your conclusions are going to be. There's no right or wrong here. It's you backing up what your conclusions are with examples from your data. So there's probably 100 ways that you could draw conclusions from the data that you have. You're going to pick a couple out of 100 and you're going to back them up. You're going to explain them by bringing to the front, to part 2, some things that you said in your literature review, and by going back to your students' comments or your comments in your field notes or whatever data is that you're using, going back to that data and using it to support the conclusions that you make. So you can't just pick those conclusions out of thin air. You have to align them with your research question, your lit review, your data, and your categories or your codes or labels that you gave and how you interpreted those. It's not easy. It's a complex process, but you get to have these awesome aha moments when you're reading that data. And your students are really teaching you what is important. And you never quite know what that's going to be until you open up your mind to interpreting what they have given you, little gifts from that data. So hope you enjoy the process. Don't make it harder than it has to be. Accept kind of those first instincts that you have and look for support to back you up. All right, thank you.